We are back, and we are joined now by Noah Kulwin, co-host of the Blowback podcast, which I can't say enough good things about, and contributing editor at Jewish Currents. Noah also writes for Defector. Noah, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
So, I felt it was important to have you on because of your foreign policy background and the fact that, you know, I can have a conversation with you that's pretty broad, but also hits on all of the very real and disturbing dynamics of what have unfolded over the past 7 days, including the latest update is that Israel is telling over 1 million Gazans to evacuate and move south in 24 hours, which is obviously impossible. The United Nations has said so. I mean, some people are leaving, understandably, but of course, understandably, but part of what the issue is that there has been an electricity and fuel blockade for 6 days at this point? How is this even being communicated to people in Gaza? Because, I saw apparently they're doing so by flyers, but there's no internet. That people can't even communicate with others in Gaza right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's this is not about actually having the idea, this whole thing of warning the citizens, telling them to evacuate and so forth. That's it's CYA. It's covering your ass. It's about basically saying, listen, we gave them excuses, we gave them reasons, etc. So you can't call this what it is, which is a genocide. It's a genocide. And you could argue that this is just simply, the next step, the logical procession from the practice of, it's okay to bomb civilian infrastructure in Gaza, so long as we drop a small bomb first on top of the building so that we call it a door knock, so that we tell them to leave. Because that's how they used to do it. And that's not a policy that they're even doing anymore now with round-the-clock bombing. So, I mean, this is there's no actual reasonable purpose for it. It's entirely about having the ex post facto justification so that when they're pulling corpses out of the rubble, they'll be able to say something to the effect of, well, they didn't have to be there. Even though, I think anybody by now who's been watching this unfold, if they know anything, it's that Gazans have absolutely nowhere to go.
Yeah, and then I think that's a good way to kind of just give a broad picture of how little power and how few resources Palestinians and Gazans have broadly. I've been trying to make this point on the show, but there have not been elections in Gaza since 2006, 2007. 70% youth unemployment, 50% unemployment more broadly. 90% of people in Gaza don't have access to clean water. So we're talking about one of the most impoverished populations in the world. And that underscores their inability to flee. But it also underscores the level of desperation that we're talking about here and the complete asymmetry when we're talking about, which side are you on? Israel versus Palestine. Palestine versus Israel. When we understand that the relationship between Israel and Palestinians is one of occupier and the occupied. And if you could just talk a bit about how that power dynamic gets so routinely flattened in the Western press.
Sure. So I think that in particular, talking about Hamas and the fact that there haven't been, elections in something like 17 years in Gaza, Gaza it's in the West Bank, a military occupation. So in the if you look at a map of Israel and you see what is labeled Palestine or Palestinian territory in a map, the Gaza Strip is what's on the left to the west on the Mediterranean Sea. And the West Bank is it's contiguous with the Jordan River, and it looks like it's in the middle of Israel. And in the West Bank, a military occupation, it looks kind of like it sounds. There are checkpoints everywhere within the territory that control the flow of movement of Palestinians. Not to mention, obviously, the checkpoints between Israel proper territory and then where Palestinians live. And additionally, there is also a system of apartheid in that literally there are roads that Palestinians are not allowed to drive on, but that Jewish settlers who live on what is internationally recognized as stolen land, pretty unequivocally, they have free access. So that's where you see a kind of conventional system of apartheid. In Gaza in 2005, under then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was a pretty right-wing figure, he made the decision quite cleverly. In retrospect, he felt he died. He became sick and died not long after. but he made the decision to, we're going to shut down the very small number of settlements that do exist in Gaza, and we're going to initiate an enhanced version of what had already been in place and been developing over time, which was a blockade, a complete, and like, if something enters Gaza officially, legally, whether it's a candy bar or it's hospital supplies, or it's an Xbox, it is, it's a process that is overseen by Israel. They are the ones who have control over what goes in and out. So this also extends, by the way, to, when we look at rubble in Gaza, and we see people using their hands and using shovels and, like manual tools to pick up, in complete apartment blocks that have fallen, to find, children in small places between the rubble, and to pull them out. That's because Israel does not allow in the heavy machinery or the construction material that's required for, the actually either both doing that job and for making the kinds of, buildings that could even be somewhat more safe, as opposed to just, high rises that Israel blows up. Or to use the phrase of Netanyahu himself in a meeting a few years ago that was later made public as a result of the corruption cases against him, Israel controls how high the flames go. They control how much resistance Gazans can offer. And so, which brings us just to this moment of, you describe what's an unequal power relationship, or the relationship between occupier and occupied. It's not just it's not just like this kind of tug of war relationship between two sides, one with less power and one with more. One of the sides controls the situation, and they control this situation in the way that they do with the inordinate body counts that they possess, both because of hyper-nationalist ideology, but also because this is the way historically that Israel has sought to maintain the control that it has over the land that it does, while giving its citizens the preferential rights that they enjoy.
And well, that brings me, I guess, to the security failure that we're talking about here. The fact that there were not adequate numbers of IDF forces on the southern border, and they were mostly going along with the settlers and aiding them in their kind of pogroms, and that's where they were deployed. And there's a lot of questions about what Netanyahu knew and what he did not know, and it's still fog of war. We're figuring all of this out. But the an Egyptian intelligence official, and again, take this with a boulder of salt because they have their own incentives as well, but they're claiming that he knew about that he was informed that this was likely.
So it's worth emphasizing that the Israeli government initially denied this very strongly, right? And then the Israeli press began reporting it as well, and there were corroborated reports. And so then you think like, okay, so wow, that sounds pretty good, right? We got multiple competing reports that corroborate and show this. There are any number of reasons why it may be that, it's not like fully or totally accurate or representative. There are also a lot of reasons, it is very persuasive as evidence that the Israelis were caught off guard, that they wanted something to happen as a pretext to initiate the kind of cyclical violence that they often do to consolidate their political bases. And, this is, you're talking about a country that has had something like half a dozen elections in the last 5-6 years. You're talking about a country that is really only able to develop something that resembles political consensus when it is engaged in wartime or quasi-wartime measures. I think the sort of what we have seen since with these denials and the other reports about the Egyptian warning is that there are knives out for Benjamin Netanyahu. He is the most unpopular man in Israel right now. I think that a lot of people kind of rightfully and sort of logically, especially Western observers, thought, oh, wow, well, Bibi's, this is going to fortify his position, right? He's a right winger. There's a terrorist attack. It's going to bolster his position. But the problem is that the Israeli public had been led to believe that not only was Bibi Mr. Security, but that the strategy that he had been pursuing in the last year, and that the policies of supporting the settlers in the West Bank and so on, that they wouldn't undermine the security calculus. That was the specific offer that he made, in a sense. And that was proven wrong. So I think that was Bibi made the fall guy for a broader failure because I don't just think it was one political leader who probably, this is, by the way, something familiar in American history. I think we can learn from, which is that oftentimes, it is like somebody bears responsibility, and they are also a fall guy for, a whole number of other parties that may have been involved, or in this case, to help direct from what is a more strategic culpability that Israel is in. Because even if Netanyahu had, is responsible for the depths of this tragedy, in that the massacres in the South committed by, Hamas fighters who had crossed from Gaza into Israel proper, if those massacres were committed, it's like Israel has this gigantic military. It's incredibly well funded. It's the raison d'etre that it tells its citizens for is to provide them security. When what incidents like this show is that actually the Israeli military is primarily deployed to maintain rest of Palestinian populations. And so I do really believe that it's a kind of like, no matter which way you slice it, like whether it was invited in or not, what the success of the attack shows, the damage it dealt to Israel, both in the civilian lives taken and in the, hostages, civilian and military hostages taken, not to mention equipment stolen and all this other stuff. It's like, whether or not there was some measure of deliberance or deliberate ignorance beforehand, it's a little bit distracting when we don't have more information, simply because what is much more significant and what has a much more substantial influence on the events on the ground now is that the attack was as successful as it was. And that sort of really points to, well, even if they had this deliberate ignorance, the strategic position that they'd put themselves in of just trying to say, well, we're going to keep pummeling Gaza and assume that even though we choke them off, they won't ever resist or they won't ever fight back in a way that we couldn't anticipate. That's been blown totally out of the water. And what that means for Hamas and for the people of Gaza remains a live question now, because Israel's response to that, revelation that the Israeli geopolitical security calculus had this flaw has been to initiate, what we should unequivocally call a genocide, a genocidal campaign to exterminate and ethnically cleanse the Palestinian population in this area. They are considered to Israel a surplus population for whom there is no purpose. And the fairly sick and disgusting prevaricating around setting up some kind of corridor through which they could shunt people out into the Sinai desert, where, Palestinians would be exposed to all sorts of other kinds of violence and depredations. A population of urban dwellers that has been in that territory for 70, 80 years at a minimum. To say nothing obvious, it's just Nakba too, with the added, with the greater horror that the machinery of war is far more deadly, and
white phosphorus. I said this in headlines.
Not only white phosphorus, but also, this is the most important part, with the outright and explicit consent of not just the American government, but the entire Western world. Mm-hmm. I don't have the words to describe the implications of that, other than to, say that it's giving a permission slip for the worst kinds of acts that man can pursue against man.
Yeah, and it also, I think it underscores the exact dynamic that that both of us, I think, are trying to communicate to our respective audiences, which is that condemning a Hamas attack is the easiest thing that one could possibly do. But we are, as Americans, our tax dollars, our government is unequivocally supporting a genocidal attempt by the Israeli government, and that is the active, live question that we are dealing with. And that is there's potential, right? Just to say, like, there's potential in theory to stop the atrocities, as opposed to constantly looking backwards as justification for the future atrocities. And that's what makes the conversation so goddamn infuriating for me, because looking backwards means that you don't have to look at the Palestinian babies under rubble.
No, and you also don't have to consider, look, I think the other part of this is that there have been photographs of, let's say, like, North Korean armaments that have probably made their way via Iran at some point in the past, we don't know when, to Hamas, and that stuff gets headlines. I've seen arm control academics share that stuff. But the more prosaic reality is, where does Hamas get its weaponry? Where do they get the tools that they use to attack Israel? They get it from Israel. They steal it. They buy it illegally. They acquire it through subterfuge. They use all sorts of methods. And then, oh, well, if Israel has it, well, where did Israel get it if they didn't produce it themselves? They got it from the West. And so even if, I have to stress this, like, even if you, are the most right-wing, most like zealously feeling it in your bones, tribal association with Israel right now, I think that, there is even still, it is worth considering and taking seriously the idea that every time you militarize and try to develop a military solution to the Palestinian problem and Palestinian statelessness, all you are doing, the only thing truly, is, fueling, is I guess reproducing, the conditions for, another cycle of violence and another genocide with weapons that you are introducing into the conflict zone and so forth. And obviously inflaming the desire for people to acquire weapons and, military means through the outside world in other ways. There is what Americans have as a unique political subjectivity. We are citizens, we are in the seat of empire and so forth. And that's why our politicians make it so easy for us and there are no consequences. There's literally nothing that will come back to you in any negative way for condemning atrocities committed by Hamas. But the moment that you start to jeopardize, some of the fundamental strategic assumptions of the American state and of our media about what protects us and what keeps us safe and how that includes a strong Israel, it's at that moment that I think you really begin to, as you say, like it reveals where actually our power as American political subjects and citizens lies. It shows that the more you talk about Palestine, the more you talk about Israeli atrocities, every word you utter publicly on that front does more to advance some kind of peace, simply because that's what our American checks are going toward. They're going toward paying for the Israeli government to, through ways that we cannot even fathom, expand the sphere of violence that consumes this place.